Life has been a very fun journey up until this point, but I guess I don't think we were recording when we were talking about that. But originally from outside of Philly, went to school, high school around there. After high school, made a random decision to dip out of the country and went over to Korea, initially just to study the language after graduating high school before college. And while I was over there learning the language, realized that the university system over there was amazing. A lot of smart Koreans, who would have thunk it? And also, the colleges at the time were trying to jump up in the international rankings. And to do that, like one of the metrics is like percentage of student population that are international students. So those universities to try to like gain those metrics were for applicable students were handing out really generous scholarships and like living stipends. So I applied over there, went to university in Korea as a result. Shout out not going into lifelong debt to get a bachelor's degree. uh, but then through that opportunity, going to a pretty good university there, like all the major tables and conglomerates like Hyundai, Samsung, all of them were like great places for internships. So ended up interning at one of the affiliates for Samsung and started working for their civil engineering and construction arm out of college when I graduated. Super random. I was in strategy, helped them then move over when they got into biologics to spin that up. And it was at that time that I came across crypto, probably around 2015, with a bunch of buddies that I'd worked with over there. Um, Went into Ethereum was my onboarding point. Programmable money, smart contracts was like super intriguing as a concept. Total, yeah, just changed kind of what I thought could be possible at that time. Shout out to Vinay Gupta and all the very old podcasts that he did that were quite inspiring at the time about the potential use cases and applications of Ethereum specifically, but crypto generally. And then from that point, pretty much just like went down that rabbit hole, was figuring out ways to use crypto more than anything. So then when CryptoKitties came out end of 2017, felt immediately head over heels for that. Like finally a use case for it. And right around that time, I joined an old platform called Cent, which the end of 2017 was more like a crypto powered Quora. Like you would use ETH, set a bounty, add it to a question, and the bounty was to incentivize answers. I saw that and I was like, holy shit, this is another use case for me to use my crypto, actually use it, not just speculate on it. And that particular use case was so consumer friendly. I just was enraptured. Couldn't stop thinking about it. Had a blog at the time, just wrote like 100 blog posts about it. Reached out to the team. I was like, yo, you got to let me on the team. They hired me on at the beginning of 2018, and we helped pivot that product into what ended up becoming like a crypto powered blog at the beginning of 2018, which timing wise was great for all the digital artists that were starting to come over because of the NFT boom that CryptoKitties opened up. And having those artists come on to Sun at that time was like, holy shit, like artists, real proper artists are minting their work. And I can now use Ether to collect actual art. This is amazing. So I was just focused on bringing more and more artists onto Sin at that time and became more of a collector and all that good stuff. And yeah, that was really for what I do now in crypto, probably like what I'd refer to as like that Genesis formative period.
Mhm.
Um, and yeah, ended up staying at Cent for a little longer into 2020, leading like the community, focusing on bringing more artists. But then, beginning of 2021, hopped over to Nifty Gateway and was a lead producer over there and was just working with all kinds of artists, bringing them to the platform, producing collections to release and all that good stuff. And was there until September this year. And now now I'm doing a whole bunch of advising, consulting, and then still working with artists on an independent basis, helping them release new work. But yeah, in a nutshell,
Awesome.
that's the story.
Well, it's a certainly a unique story, and really interesting to hear like the twists and turns. It's surprising, like CryptoKitties. I feel like I know you were already, into Ethereum prior to that, but I've been surprised, like only within the last year, I've heard a few different stories of people like CryptoKitties being the first thing that brought a lot of people in. Like for me, it was Bitcoin.
Mhm.
And not that it was like earlier or anything, it was probably around that time, but it's interesting. I feel like CryptoKitties, obviously it gets a lot of respect, but I think it has a pretty decent weight among other projects that like brought people, were people sort of like original entry point into crypto, sort of funny enough. Um, but yeah, anyway, sort of rewinding a little bit, just I'll just, have a few sort of like random questions coming out of your story. But what was it that made you go to Korea? Like, deciding to sort of like leave the country and go somewhere else on its own is sort of a unique decision. But were there other like candidates in terms of countries you wanted to go, or was the draw specifically to go to Korea?
So when I was in middle school, I went to boarding school, and at that time, one of my roommates was Korean, and there's a sizable Korean population at our school,
Right.
and I was always like, whenever I'd walk by them, like coming back from like evening practice or from the mess hall or whatever, I would hear them talking, and I'm like, that is a proper foreign language. I have no idea what they're saying, and I always
Yeah.
thought that was like the coolest thing. So from that point, I'd always just been intent on trying to learn and like speak the language. Couldn't like my friends at the time, they're all learning English. They're like, I don't have time to teach you Korean, dude. So when I actually had the opportunity, like to be able to go and learn, I was like, all right, let's do it. No time better than now, getting out of high school before I know what I want to do in the world. So did it. Work landscaping that summer, saved up enough for the tuition and airfare and all that good stuff, and yeah, sent myself abroad.
Nice. Yeah. So it was really more of a draw to Korea than a general desire to like go international and choosing Korea from a number of options. And yeah, I'm a huge fan of, yeah, I took a year between my freshman year of college and my second year, trying to like work on a company basically, but most importantly, just like not being in school. And I think anytime around that, like, graduating high school through college time to be able to take a year or just go and do something quite different. Um, it's a nice step off the beaten path earlier than most people like sort of have the opportunity or take the opportunity to do that. And I think it sort of sets you up for, I mean, at least for me, and it sounds like for you, it sort of sets you on a path or a lack thereof to do just generally like more different things and, ask questions about, do I have to do things a certain way that most people seem to be doing them, or can I do things differently? And certainly going to school in Korea is one of those things that would set you off on sort of like a little bit of a different path. And then obviously stumbling into crypto is another one. Um, so Cent was like
Yeah,
before, was it like a sort of a mirror or, a paragraph now, like sort of thing, but all the way back in 2018 when I mean, you mentioned it had like the Q&A, like the Quora component,
hmm
but was it also like you mentioned you were doing some blogging? Were you blogging on there or are you blogging elsewhere?
yeah. Started originally on Blogspot, but for Scent specifically, yeah, it was like an early version of Mirror, probably, and I'd also consider it like an early version of like what Warpcast and like the Farcaster
Hmm.
systems emerged and become. At the time, the only other like sort of crypto powered blogging alternative was Steemit, which was, I don't know, let's call it the blue sky of its
Right.
day. It was it was a place. It wasn't a very particularly welcoming place for folks that
Huh.
weren't there at the very beginning. And that was also part of the reason I was like, F this. Like, I want to use crypto, but like this is a terrible situation. Let's make a better context for people getting together and sharing and posting and stuff like that. So yeah, it was yeah, just the it's still around today. You search beta.cent.co, you can still see all the old posts. I was Matthew on there. But yeah, it was just like a really easy, simple place to post. It had the ability to add the bounty to blog posts to incentivize that engagement, which I had been like posting into the ether on Blogspot for almost 10 years before I had started using or joined Scent. And literally no one read my shit. There was no engagement, no feedback, nothing. And I was like, it is what it was. It was great and a great exercise to post and all of that. But I was like, I was so hungry, so thirsty for that engagement. And to
Right.
be able to use like a simple bounty to incentivize actually thoughtful engagement, not just people trying to farm and like get free crypto, but like real thoughtful engagement. I was like, oh, this is awesome. One, just to finally get some readers, but two, it's like seeing the fact that okay, most people associate if you're paying for views and likes, like they're not real views or likes. There's
Right.
that kind of opinion out there, which largely holds true, but not all the time, and not like it's not a law or anything like that. And seeing that the fact that okay, this real thoughtful engagement, this is kind of cool, like a nice insight. And a lot of other people saw it too. And then we leaned into some other like crypto primitives. I think it's really similar to what Hypersub's doing for like follow on subscribers, where early subscribers get like a cut of follow on subscriptions. We had something called seeding where people they could tip the original poster, but then any other like earlier seeders or tippers, they would get a cut of the follow on tips, just as like a weird crypto primitive to incentivize tipping and engagement. So we ran a few cool crypto experiments over at Cent
And is that all
early
that
on.
was all going on Ethereum mainnet at the time?
Yeah, our approach was to avoid the gas fees that mainnet, particularly at that time, was prone to when even just like it was being moderately used, was
Right.
to leverage payment channels. So you would deposit into a payment channel, and then folks would be able to gaslessly send and tip and use their crypto for bounties and stuff like that. And then they would just withdraw it to mainnet whenever they wanted to leave or cash out or whatever like that. So that was the like really easy approach as opposed to spinning up like an L2 or something like that.
Yeah.
The payment channel was at that time the best option for like really easy, fluid UI.
Yeah. And just doing everything like on Ethereum basically isn't an option. It's just that's what I was wondering because, with tipping and any of these like smaller transaction actions, which obviously we're seeing more prevalently now with,
Mm-hmm.
base, other L2s or lower fee blockchains. Back then, like some of these things, like you've talked about, a couple times, wanting to use the technology, not just speculate on it. And
Yeah.
for a lot of things, using it, in the earlier days just wasn't really like there's a reason some of these things that were always envisionable as possible are only coming about, in the last year or two. It's just they just weren't really as feasible previously with the fees and everything. So but it's always interesting to
100%.
hear about experiments like, well, not experiments, but proper, companies like Cent and Steemit. I've always heard mentioned as like, one of the OG social experiments within crypto. I never got involved
Mm-hmm.
and I hadn't heard of it till it was sort of like past its time. But all of these things are I think people have had the idea that they could be very interesting for a long time and now they finally feel like they're hitting their stride. I think for you and
Mm-hmm.
I and for the context of this podcast, I think a lot of it we're experiencing on Farcaster, but
Yep.
elsewhere as well, people are doing things and trying things and it's pretty cool. If you're someone who has been interested in using the technology and not just speculating on the technology, not that there's anything wrong with that. Like I've, owned some crypto for a long time, obviously myself, but I've sort of been dying to like see what's possible with crypto that just wasn't possible or at least practical previously. And it feels like all of that is just sort of coming online almost at once and starting to work. And Farcaster, not to necessarily plug the sort of the basis of this podcast, but Farcaster to me is like the home to be able to get exposure to all of that as it's early and still experimental, and some of it's working and some of it's not, but feels like the place to be.
1,000%. Like that is why I'm on it and keeps me coming back day after day. The the fact that there's just such a large population of devs in and around building and tinkering and releasing like early primitive experiments, like, yeah, that's freaking awesome. But it's also that combination plus regular consumer users plus all the other, like the growing list of features and like features that are supportable. It's just so, it's the wild west of awesome experimentation. And there's weird experiments, there's experiments that blow up seemingly overnight. That is just the most, it makes it the most interesting place for me to be on the internet pretty much on the daily. And like the most
Yeah.
recent example with the Anon arc, where
Yeah.
I got shout out Woj for trying the like the half step between a really cool like anonymous posting idea and like provably anonymous, like I guess like trustlessly
Right.
implementation of it. Like Super Anon was awesome, and seeing what is 33 bits and then Anoncast like in the past week, like really kind of blow up, and people getting excited off of that and having that consumer ZK posting app kind of like really jump into the spotlight for a second on the Purple app has been really really awesome to see and think through and be a part of. But yeah, co-signing everything you just said.
Yeah, it might be it's always, interesting when these new things flare up, like Anon being the latest example. There's I sort of separate things, anything like new within crypto. Not that it has to be necessarily novel, like Anon largely is, but just anything really that comes out. Basically it can be, sort of a dud, and then you don't hear about it, or it can be sort of like this big, has all the attention for the day. And then beyond like one of those two starting points, and obviously it can be somewhere in between, but you just sort of like take those two extremes. Most things are like roughly a dud, and then a few things sort of like pop off. And then after that, like I find that beginning, like that launch reception, isn't necessarily very indicative of the long term. I mean, to be fair, like if it's a dud at launch, it's most likely going to be a dud long term.
Mm-hmm.
But if it's a big launch, it's like also still most likely going to be like roughly a dud in the long term. Um, and the things that persist long term and do well long term and have, life beyond just sort of like a limited launch window. I
Mm-hmm.
feel like it's not even it's like almost not even correlated. Like you can have things that have these quieter launches without much fanfare and then over time develop into these, huge projects. I mean, Farcaster even, not to say it was like under the
Mm-hmm.
radar, obviously it's like prominent founders and team and raised money and
Mm-hmm.
everything, but they grew, the user base quite slowly. Like I think in the beginning it was like individual Zoom calls with new users, and then
Mm-hmm.
they sort of gradually sort of built it out, but it was invite only, and been a very slow sort of development up until maybe, I don't know, like a year ago when Frames came out that brought a lot of users on and everything
Mm-hmm.
like that. But it wasn't like you contrast it to, a BitClout or a Friendtech, which were like, other social crypto experiments. And both those like launched with a huge bang and
Mm-hmm.
subsequently fell off with like a huge, you know, fall off or drop or whatever you want to call it. And so it's like the launch isn't necessarily indicative, but and for that reason, when you see something like Anon, like I personally think that this has longevity to it. Um, it's genuinely new. It's genuinely interesting. Like you said, it's actually one of the first cases I think where like ZK proofs are sort of like, you know, obviously relevant like to consumers, like in the feed, like they're actually
Yeah.
being useful, rather than just sort of like theory or sort of working behind the scenes for, a privacy coin or like something like that. Which
Mm-hmm.
is also, which is cool, but it's just not as like sort of engageable and like in the feed, so to speak. And so it's interesting, like right now as we're talking, Anon is sort of like it's been going for like the last week roughly, I would say, in this like sort of I know like I think Super Anon was around before that. I actually wasn't really paying attention when that part of it started, but with
Mm-hmm.
like Anoncast and everything that's been in the last week or so, and it'll get that initial surge, and then the question is like, how does it persist? But I think that I've always, not always, but having launched my like sort of online identity in a pseudonymous way myself. I mean, my name is Jake, but I don't share my last name. I don't share photos of myself. So I'm sort of like on
Hmm.
the spectrum of pseudonymity. I've always
Hmm.
been, very in favor of things like this, and I'm bullish on just like there's this whole other potential part of the internet that could exist with um, stronger pseudonymity, basically more of a sense of anonymity, and in a little bit of a
Hmm.
different way. Like you said, like obviously you can start a Twitter and do like what I've done, and like not share. You don't have to share your first name, even you don't share photos, whatever, and you can operate pretty anonymously, pretty pseudonymously. But to sort of beef that up a little bit with like ZK Tech, um, I think it's sort of the beginning of what could be a very interesting era on the internet.
Yeah, no, it is. It's such a cool, exciting experiment. I've heard a few people try to start framing it in interesting ways. Like one of the earlier framings was like Tornado Cash for hot takes, which I thought is
Huh.
pretty cool. Like I like that Tornado Cash for thoughts, for words. I think that's a cool framing. I saw someone posted earlier today talking about like the emergence of like silent social. So with I guess the anonymous posting that you have on Anoncast or Superanon or whatever, like it's sort of like a whisper. Like you don't have the background identity attached to things. It's like just the pure thought, and that sort of dovetails with like the I guess increased popularity of the interface app. Shout out Ouija. I think that's how you pronounce their name, where you're able to listen in to what would otherwise be like silent on-chain actions. And
Right.
then even like the actions that folks take in general on the daily, like whether you're collecting base colors or digital art or whatever, like minting or collecting itself is like it's a silent action. Same thing with trading, and all those are starting to come together kind of in an interesting way that presents just an alternative path to the traditional like loud social media approach that a lot of us have gotten used to, which I thought was pretty interesting. And again, to have that be powered by like ZK proofs, crypto, this more sufficiently decentralized protocol that brings together all those things in interesting ways. It just I don't know, for folks that are interested in not just like thinking about the future, but like actively taking a part and helping to shape it and participate in it. It's just a very very cool thing to have all of this be available to anyone who's interested enough with an internet connection. It's all just a couple clicks away.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I hadn't actually heard this like silent versus loud concept. But it makes me think of a few things. One is like, another sort of uh dichotomy you can put there is like just public versus private, and public being loud, private being silent. And
Mm-hmm.
you're taking these things that would otherwise be private or silent and making them public or loud in the case of Anon, but somewhat ironically by like making the public thing private in terms of the author. That gets a little confusing with those terms that I use, but if you follow along, it kind of makes sense. And what I think, made me think of actually, um, well, a couple of things. So one is one of the interesting things about crypto that's sort of counterintuitive because it tends to be, you know, um, I feel like the people in the industry, like if you took crypto people and non-crypto people, crypto people tend to value privacy, I think, more than the average person, at least in their stated preferences. Um, but ironically, like crypto is like so public, like everything you do, all of your financial
Yeah.
transactions are publicly available. So it's like this weird thing where it's these, Bitcoin's created by Satoshi, who's anonymous, and yet, and I think maybe the culture sort of stemmed from that to some degree in terms of this focus on privacy. You also have people like Vitalik who are really into privacy, and um, Zuko and Zcash, and influential people within the space have been, Edward Snowden, even like influential people have been very pro privacy, and yet it is this like default public space, which has somewhat gotten away with, in my view, almost pretending to be private. Not pretending and like, so I'm not like accusing anyone of doing anything wrong here. It's just sort of accidentally pretended to be private in that we didn't have like sort of the human readable apps like interface which you mentioned, which make it extremely easy to see these things which have always been public, but you have to sort of like be somewhat technical or dig into various things. Like you have to go to considerable effort to figure these things out which are available to find out, but not obviously in your face. And now with something like interface, there's a consumer app, and it's not the only example obviously. There's consumer apps that bring this public information into the public eye in a seamless way where you don't have to be technical or go out of your way to find it. And I feel like as this public information becomes more obviously public and more readily available and readable to everyone, people will probably sort of swing back the other way and be like, oh, like I didn't realize, as I was doing all of these, like you said, sort of like silent actions, like, trading meme coins or doing whatever else, minting NFTs, people aren't really thinking about, I think yet, maybe just starting now, but previously people I don't think were really thinking about like this, everyone can see this at any time. Farcaster's actually, another example, like much different than Twitter, because like it's sort of a double-edged sword because it's all, it's not like just sort of Twitter centrally controlling everything. Um, like everything you do on Farcaster is like easily searchable, at least in theory, like easily searchable for anyone to like, if you want to dig up someone's old tweet to like cancel them. And, I think hopefully cancel culture is like peaked and we're moving on from that a little bit. But like, if you wanted to do that, it's like much easier to do on Farcaster. You search for keywords and someone's like cast history or whatever, and like, boom, like, you're done. So
Mm.
it'll be interesting to see if the pendulum sort of swings in the other direction where as these silent actions become on display, will people's preferences swing towards things like a non-cast, where you can cast without it being attributed to your account, or privacy coins, which I've been honestly pretty surprised for all the reasons I've sort of mentioned over the last, like, since I got into crypto, so I don't know, 7 years or so. Like one of the first thing that got me in was like Bitcoin, feeling like I understood that and the value of it. But soon after that, I would say like Zcash really um, piqued my attention in that it was basically a private version of Bitcoin, roughly speaking. And I was like, if the world needs Bitcoin, the world's going to need Zcash as well, or something like it. And it just never really hit, like, and it just never really like sort of got picked up in a material way. And there's like Monero, it's another privacy coin, and there's some other ones, but none of them have really, we're not talking about them being like top 10, top 20 even coins in terms of market cap, along the lines of like, Bitcoin, Ethereum, Solana, Doge, your handful of other L1s, whatever else, stable coins. Like I would expect at least one privacy coin to be a part of that, like most valuable cryptocurrencies in the world conversation, and it just hasn't been. And maybe as some of what's always been public becomes more easily like parsed by consumers through these consumer apps, maybe as that increases, the value that like people's stated preference for some privacy will start to become an actual revealed preference. Because so far it sort of makes people, at least people in crypto, seem somewhat hypocritical, like myself included to some degree, in that like we say we value privacy, but like we're doing all of this stuff in public.
Yeah, I've thought about this a little bit, and I think a lot of people are saying privacy when in actuality they mean control of like what people see, or like who owns what or what's
Mm-hmm.
attributed. Like I think it's the control at base, which is what people want more of, as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to just actual privacy for everything they do. Like, of course, like anonymously posting now is like a really interesting angle, but for the like anonymized financial transactions, like, yeah, for sure, if you're doing something illegal, you want to obfuscate that and disassociate it from like your government like uh name and accounts and stuff like that. But for the most part, like regular people, that doesn't matter. But communicating anonymously, that could for sure end up being something that matters more and could be more interesting to folks. But the control that crypto allows, like the ability to self custody, is absolutely major. And I think that when people talk about wanting or like the privacy side of crypto, they really mean the control aspect, that crypto really puts all the control, if you want, back into your hands, which I find
Right.
far more interesting as a use case. Because, like, I don't know, real talk, this is probably a controversial opinion, but I really wish the government made it so much easier, like in our context, the American government, to link all of our accounts to like tax authorities to make it easier to pay taxes. Like I want
Right.
it to be public. I love that fact. Like it we should pay lower taxes because all of our transactions are like public from the get-go. So it should be easier in theory to tax and all that good stuff. So I don't know. That's
Yeah.
my 2 cents
I,
on it.
I mean, the tax thing is a whole separate hairy subject, but just paying taxes is it is the process. If it was all public, I mean, people who are, undercutting or whatever would be obviously paying more, but I think a lot of people in trying to do the right thing and not, do anything bad, which is sort of obviously the thing that you want to avoid, you end up overpaying to your point. And so having something that's automated could be good. I think, to your point, that is probably somewhat controversial and that a lot of people wouldn't like that, but it seems like at the very least we need something a lot easier. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole because frankly, it's just like not, we don't need to be talking about taxes too much, but it's just like, it's just, there's a few things that feel like they're a part of this sort of like legacy system of the way that the world works that are just so ridiculously complicated that should not be. And the big two, in my view, are like taxes and maybe there's others, but taxes and health insurance is also insanely complicated and
Mm-hmm.
expensive and a hassle and like two of my least favorite things basically. But you got to do them. Basically they both cost money and
Mm-hmm.
time. Like usually
Mm-hmm.
you want things that you're willing to do something that costs time if it makes money, or you're willing to spend money on something that can save you time. And both of those things uh, can take considerable effort and time, and the outcome is that you pay money. And it's just like, I just, both not fun things. But the other thing I was going to say is, what was it? You're talking about control. Oh, so you mentioned like, the privacy or the control is sort of like useful in the financial transaction side of things if you're doing, illegal things for obvious reasons. But I do want to like sort of double click on that because I think it does go far beyond that. Like obviously what people are doing in terms of crypto now is a lot of like, buying and I mean, as of the last few months or whatever, it's a lot of like buying and selling meme coins or more established coins or whatever else. Mostly just sort of like fun speculative stuff. But hey, can you still hear me? All right.
Yeah, yeah.
Just got a call, just ignore. But so mostly what people are doing is it's sort of like inconsequential. Roughly, it's like not that bad to have it be like fully exposed. But if you think about the amount of information that like, I don't know what credit card you use, but like let's say Visa um, has on you, and in turn, like the government could have on you if they were to, get that information from Visa, which they can do. There's like a scary amount of information. Like they know where you go to breakfast and get your coffee, and like they can basically just track you at all times through what you're spending money on. But as a result of that, where you are, what you like they can kind of know everything about you between your
Mm-hmm.
physical spending and your digital spending. And so that's the sort of thing that I think people will want to guard, not because it's obviously like illegal, but because you're giving potentially, like right now, I'm not buying lunch in crypto. I'm not doing my Amazon orders in crypto. The stuff that I'm doing in crypto is mostly not as consequential in terms of like something that I want to keep private. But if and when, and there's an argument to be made that you will never pay for coffee in crypto. I don't feel like super strongly about this stuff. I think it's more likely with stable coins that you might be. I think like paying for coffee in Bitcoin never really made a ton of sense for various reasons. But like crypto is good for really small transactions and really and really large transactions and purely digital transactions. For the middle stuff that's physical, I don't know if it makes as much sense. But again, why not use USDC instead of Apple Pay? There's no good reason not to. So like it could very well turn crypto. And if that if that does happen, um, you will basically be allowing anyone to have the amount of potential insight on you and surveillance. You could argue, it's more of a negative word, but like the ability to surveil uh, at the level that like a Visa or a government might currently, which I don't think anyone wants. And so that's where like I think this privacy sort of at least of financial transactions comes into play. And then beyond financial transactions, if you think about the Farcaster example from earlier, um, sure, like obviously I don't want people knowing like my every location based on where I spend money. And I mentioned also like you could sort of garner a person's interests from the things that they're spending money on, and then maybe take advantage of them, so to speak, on like advertising and stuff like that more so. And then so that's where like sort of Farcaster comes in. It's like, okay, if I can like very quickly apply AI to the history of someone's content that they've shared because it's all on chain, then what does that mean? Like I probably don't want I might not want that out there necessarily either. But it's like, what's the alternative to that? I'm not sure. That's like, you could roughly do that with Twitter already. So it's like I'm not sure how to protect against that necessarily. But it's just an interesting question. I feel that privacy is going to become more and more relevant, and people who don't care yet will start to care. But I also think people have probably been saying that for a long time, and it hasn't really necessarily come to fruition yet. So it's hard to foresee, but it's definitely an interesting problem. Um, and yeah, we'll kind of have to just see it play out, I guess.
Yeah, I still think it comes back to the control aspect though, because like the examples of like whatever credit card company seeing all your transaction history and like they having that black box, and like even over and above you as an individual, they probably have way more insight to what you're doing just because they have everything like indexed, organized, whatever in their databases.
Right.
Or like the healthcare sector, wherever the files resides, like that's where that is, as opposed to an individual making a conscious choice to like, okay, let's transact public, like be thoughtful and put that out there publicly, and then maybe someone develops service that is really useful to me or benefits me more than like a private company that has this information that's selling it or using it
Right.
to target me or whatever. That's where I feel like the individual control and like the thoughtful control plays a bigger role than just hiding information outright. So you can make a decision to control what you make public or not. And that's where I
Right.
see like a more interesting future emerging with this, and not necessarily it being so black and white as before, but definitely way more of a spectrum of potential benefits to me. Again, as long as the individual is like thoughtful about what they're sharing, what they're posting, what they're buying, because of that like intrinsically like public nature for the most part for what we do, especially digitally with that footprint.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I've had framed it as like you get sort of these like almost predatory advertisers like selling you stuff that you don't like want to buy but will buy like based on your history or whatever. But then on the flip side of that coin, to your point, it's like by if you can control what you're putting out there, or even if you can't, it does enable like amazing personalized recommendations, not only of like products you might want to buy, but for example, like people you might want to meet, or I think the whole
Mm-hmm.
dating apps situations seems. I would be surprised if that persists as like the main way people meet each other, at least in their current form. But you could
Mm-hmm.
imagine a future version where like you just see someone's what they've done on the internet in terms of like what they posted, and you can get like very
Or like,
more closer, something closer to like how Netflix recommends you a new show based on what you've watched, rather than just
yeah,
like here's the people in your area, swipe left, swipe right.
yeah, no, like I thought about it a lot when it comes to especially collecting digital art. right? There's a whole, like, out of the array of artists I've collected and like specific works, especially the limited edition works where there's more than one copy available or whatever, there's so many more like igloo collectors, other people that I don't know who have also collected and or hold like the same editions that I do. Like, in my mind, if someone is thoughtful enough to collect art, especially, and like the same work of art, there's a high chance that I'd probably get along with
Yeah.
that individual or vibe with them in some shape, way, or form, right? So leveraging like those very public data points thoughtfully to try to bring people together socially. Yeah, 100% agree with you. Like there's way more ways to skin a cat than just trying to get people together to fuck or whatever the end goal
Yeah.
of the digital apps are. So I see like a really interesting potential future there. But we'll see what actually ends up manifesting.
There was an app, I forget what it was called, but I feel like I might be making this up, but I'm pretty sure there was an app at some point that I saw like maybe within the last year, like closer to a year ago, that took your geographic location. And I mean, we're talking about all this privacy stuff with your permission, took your geographic location and sort of, drew a circle around it or whatever, and found people, within your rough proximity that held similar, you connect your wallet as well, and it found people like sort of near you geographically who, held similar NFTs, I think it was, to you, more. It might have also just been like, fungible tokens as well, but just basically people with things in their wallet that, to your point, like made it so that you might sort of be more inclined to, or more likely to get along. And that's super cool. I think we will see stuff like that. I forget the name of this particular one or what it was, and I don't know how it's doing, but I think that I agree that that stuff is super interesting. Another sort of if you'll indulge this bit of a segue, I think one of the areas in which I've actually sought to live more publicly is
Mm-hmm.
in audio conversation, like we're having now. And so, like
Mm-hmm.
when I started my podcast, my other podcast, at a certain point, like this was like I started it during COVID, was living like a pretty, like, wasn't really leaving the house much and pretty antisocial, other than, the podcasts and well, I mean, other stuff too, but like the podcast was like a large percentage, I guess, of, having conversations with new people who I didn't already know. And as I was doing that, I was like, I'm sort of these conversations are intended to be public, but I'm sort of like, after I'll record a podcast and then I go and I go for a walk and call a friend and we have a really interesting conversation. And I'm like, you know, why shouldn't that be public? Like, we didn't talk about anything, um, super sensitive. Um, and that was like really interesting. Like, maybe we're talking about, I'm talking with my buddy, who's like really into real estate, and we're just like talking about that. And I'm like, some people, like, I don't know who, but out of the 8 billion people in the world, like some people would be interested in hearing that conversation and could gain value from that conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't hurt me and it doesn't hurt my friend. There's no loss. And there's only sort of the upside of having people out there gain value from it and potentially like sort of,
Mm-hmm.
building a following over time in the same way that you do with a podcast. And so at a time, I remember thinking, maybe I should just go default public with all of my phone conversations. And I never really did that, but this, like, with Purple People, it's definitely a step in that direction, because this is roughly, I mean, like I said, this is sort of a little bit of an exception, and it won't be like an extreme exception, like it's going to happen a bunch, but still the majority. And what I mean by that is that we've already, talked before a couple times, but most of the people I have on, I imagine that, the majority, at least, I don't know how much the majority is, like 60% or 90%, but the majority will be people who I haven't had audio conversations with before, only have like interacted with the feed in the feed or in DMs. And to be able to like sort of share that first conversation, like that's not something that most people would maybe naturally do. Most people would say, like, hey, you want to, you know, have a call just, privately. And I'm just sort of defaulting to, like, I would love to have a conversation, but let's do it, publicly on this podcast. And I'm doing the same thing that I would otherwise do. I'm going for a walk and having an enjoyable call. We're talking about stuff that I, if this was off the record, I'd be interested in talking about anyway, and just sharing it. And I think that's I just think podcasting is so interesting. I still think podcasting is so early. I mean, we've talked about this a little bit, that it might be so early that it won't even be called podcasting. It's already sufficiently departed from truly being podcasting, and that a lot of them are now videos, some with more interesting visual content than others. You have everything on the spectrum from like Joe Rogan sitting across from a guy in a studio to I consider like Jerry Seinfeld's Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee. I forget if we've talked about this before, but like I would call that a podcast. It's like a very interesting conversation and funny. Um, and granted, it's like somewhat edited in that there's like a lot of cutting between scenes and whatnot, but it roughly holds together as a conversation. And the visual is so much more interesting to me because you have, Seinfeld and another comedian or whatever who are like, walking the streets of LA and going to get coffee at a cafe and all this, it's just much more interesting than seeing two guys sit across from each other for 2 hours or whatever. In my opinion, as like someone who mostly listens to podcasts audio only. So anyway, that's a lot of there's a lot of meat there. But the purpose of the segue was actually to ask you what the story is around your podcasting in parallel to everything you mentioned earlier. Like, you've got a couple of different programs, and would love to hear sort of how those came about, and we can talk about podcasting just more generally as well.
Yeah, I want to dig into what you're talking about too, because it's sort of like this trend towards open sourcing a lot of things in life that maybe previously, especially before like certain technical developments, would have been like super private, like with the podcast front, like these conversations. And a few decades prior, these would all be private conversations that maybe we could like write an article for that could get syndicated in some like newspaper or magazine or something like months or years after the fact. But with tech now, we can just selectively open source these conversations that other people may find helpful.
Yeah.
I think you see the same trend for like what, right, like arguably what Vivek and Elon, for example, are going to be doing with Doge, the government efficiency initiative, where it looks like and it seems like they're setting it up such that the actions, their thoughts are broadcast. It's open source for the people to see and interpret and give a vote of confidence or critique or whatever. And it's that trend towards open sourcing previously like what would have been private actions, I think is really fascinating because you start to see just a whole lot of your ability to quickly iterate and refine, improve, cut things is just exponentially increased, which is amazing. And I think there's great value for individual participants who are open sourcing parts of their life, as well as people that are on the periphery watching like actively and like thinking through things, right? And in terms of like my own personal, like the podcast that I do with Rizzle each week, that's really just to kind of like it's a great excuse to sync with a buddy whom like is on the other side of the US to be able to talk shit and just like get another check on what's going on in the space, gut check things, laugh, have fun, but in a way, and talking about it and thinking through new developments that other people may find potentially helpful or stimulate counter views that then help refine and inform like my view. Like at root, that's what the podcast is now. It started out, I think you had talked about this, like your walk and talks back in the day, where it was like a soliloquy, like you're just
Right.
like talking to yourself. Like that's how the podcast actually started. I kicked it off, I think, was it June or July 2019? Just like it was like a thought of the day, just kind of like talking about that real quick in like 5 minute quick doses. And
With
then
Rizzle
that,
or just on your own?
no, just on my own. Like, I just kicked
Yeah.
it off on my lonesome, put it out there to see if people vibed with it or not. Got a couple people listening to it. This is all in scent days. So like I was like throwing it out there, seeing if it hit or not, got some good traction. And very immediately, like at that same time, I was also doing a lot of async interviews with fellow sentients or the users of Scent then. and they weren't recorded. And I was like, oh my God, like these conversations are great. And yeah, like the transcript is good, but a lot of people, it's just audio form factor just is much better for conversations because that's how they actually happened. So I was like, okay, well let's take the podcast and start like an interview series. Did that, started interviewed Rizzle like a couple months after that. And then we just vibed so well that we were like, hey, do you want to pivot like my independent podcast into like a two talking head thing and see if we can talk to at that time some of the people that were early building in crypto? And we were like, yeah, let's fucking do it. So we kicked that off by bringing on like Devin Finzer from OpenSea, John Crane and crew from Super Rare, Sid from Triroll, the
Were
old social
these
currency thing. Yeah.
were these you mentioned sentient, which is a sweet term, but were these people at this point you had moved on from just people with like early users of Cent and you're just talking to anyone in crypto basically who's building things?
Yeah, the early podcast then was anyone that was posting on Scent doing interesting things. So like Austin Griffith, the crack dev who's still present and doing amazing things today now. Like he had an early NFT project that it was like Pogs as NFTs. So I was like, holy shit, got to talk with you about that. Quickly, it became overrun with artists just because artists were flocking to the site. And that's where
Yeah.
most of the interviews with creators ended up being predominantly with artists. And that was like a spotlight series for Cent, is how I would categorize that. But then on the other hand, with Rizzle, like the interview series with other builders in the ecosystem, a pretty large focus on NFTs, but not specifically, started to take off. And again, it's just like open sourcing some of these really cool conversations that we were able to have with early builders of projects in the space, because everyone's so approximately close together, just a click away, a DM away. And yeah, every one of those conversations, as you know, you get like a bigger name on the show. It makes it that much easier to get other interesting people to talk with. And then you're open sourcing that and you get some listenership and it compounds.
Yeah, it's well there's a couple things there, but it's funny, like whenever I hear someone who's been doing a podcast for at least like 2 3 years, you really know unless they have like a really really large audience. I actually don't know what your guys' audience is, but in terms of size, but like um at a certain point, it's like if you're doing it for years, you must really love it and enjoy it, or certain elements of it at least, because like I think the idea that a lot of people have is that podcasting is like some professional thing that like you should do if you like want to be a podcaster or something like that. And like that's never
Mhm.
been, I mean, like technically, I'm a podcaster and that I have a podcast, but like I don't like tell people like I'm a podcaster. Like that's not like there are certain people who it is their primary thing and like their only thing, but I think to view podcasting as a or again, if you generalize it even more, because I think the name is becoming less and less reflective of just like what it is. If you view like just having conversations and share, or if you want to call them interviews, if they're more interview style, that's fine too. But like having these, audio conversations and sharing them publicly, like it's such a shame, I think, to view that as something that's only available to people if you want to have it be like sort of your main thing or like a career or something like that. Because on the one hand, it's just like so limiting to the number of, but basically it's just so limiting to the number of people who can do it, because it's like
Mhm.
you're only going to make money from it if you're on like sort of the far end of like the power law of people with the biggest audiences. It's not really monetizable at a lower level audience. But at the same time, like I know I've observed like with my podcast, which doesn't have a tremendous audience, and certainly this one doesn't either. It's just starting. Um, I do it because it's fun, and because like I said earlier, it's like why not share the conversation if even two people, one person, whatever, gets value from it, it's no harm to me or the other person, then that's like just sort of a net positive thing to share it. And so I think like
Mhm.
my suspicion is that there will be something roughly analogous to like there's blogging and then there's microblogging basically through Twitter, which sort of made writing on the internet a lot more popular. And I sort of hope that it's not the same exact thing with podcasting because I like medium and long form. And I think it would be a shame to have, you know, just like a very short form audio thing become more popular. That like at the, I mean, it's fine if it becomes popular, but at the cost of the long form stuff, I think would be kind of unfortunate in my view. Um, but yeah, basically when like people are doing these podcasts, like you and I think where it's like, not the only thing, it's just a thing. Um, I just love to see that because it's like it's something where if you go into it, like I know a bunch of people do, like I've talked to people who have this perspective that they view it as something that can become their main thing or that like they're doing with the intention of becoming their main thing. And if and when they realize that that's not going to happen, they're not going to do it anymore. And I think once you see someone who's been doing it for, a number of years, it's like clearly there's something else that's nice about podcasting besides just the ability to monetize. And it's an amazing bonus. Like, we both talked about, like, if you can compound an audience over a decade plus that, turns into, tens of thousands of people or hundreds of thousands of people, like that's awesome. But I know with my podcast, I get somewhere between my main podcast, I get somewhere between like a few hundred and some of the better episodes, like a few thousand listeners. And to me, I think about that. I'm like, okay, if I release one of these like once a week, um, and it's an hour, and a few hundred people are listening to each episode, there's more. If you add up all of that time, let's say like 300 people, or yeah, let's say just 300 people listening for an hour every week. Like there's only 24 times 7 hours in a week, and so basically, if you spread it all out, like there's always, if you were to spread everyone listening to the podcast out, like there's always someone listening to my podcast. And that's so cool to me because like I'm not spending a tremendous amount of time on it. I think it just speaks to the imbalance of consumers versus producers on the internet, where it's still so early that even if you do something that's like not that, doesn't like go huge, it's still going to get this like way overweighted number of sort of people engaging, people spending time with it versus what it takes to put in. And to be fair, there is sort of another side of that equation. Like you said, you were posting into the ether with your early blog, and I was doing the exact same thing where that was not the way that the equation worked. Like I'd spend, a few hours on a blog post and three people would read it. It probably takes them 10 minutes each. So like that equation doesn't work out quite the same as the podcast. But yeah, it's been really interesting, and like that was part of like that whole logic I just kind of explained is part of why I was like, you know, I'm just gonna start another one. Like it's not that much time, and like yeah, I could start to just have these people on my main podcast, but like it feels like a sufficiently different thing. I want to walk during it. I want it to be more spontaneous and less prepared. I want it to be just Farcaster people, and like you combine those two things, and it's like, all right, I don't need to force this into my one podcast just because there's this idea that like podcasters don't do multiple podcasts. I can just
Mhm.
do a different thing, and you've done the same thing. And like so with the whip, for example, which I was fortunate to get an invite to. It was so cool. Is this other dimension that I don't know if we haven't touched on yet, which is adding like a VR component, which I'm also super bullish on. So when did that come about relative to your original show with Bizzle?
That the first like prototype show of the whip happened November of 2019, and it
Great.
started in the like an old broke ass mini like hard to find chat feature in Scent, and then like it was born out of, okay, we have all these people posting asynchronously on the Scent blog essentially, like everyone, there's a lot of people all around the world. Can we figure out a time when like we can get together all together at the same time? And I, for whatever reason, I had settled on like 12 p.m. Pacific time Thursday when I was in Korea, which was like Friday 4 or 5 a.m. But just because like kind of worked out for most people that were using the platform. And I think that first November show, like get together, about 10 people came, and like after five people typing at the same time in the chat became unwieldy. So I had to call an audible and I was like, hey guys, let's jump over to CryptoVoxels. I know their chat is a lot better in like for a number like this. Let's see what happens. So we all jumped in as our avatars in CryptoVoxels. And it was kind of funny flying around Origin City at the time, talking for like 30 minutes, seeing what was going on and people sharing what they were working on or interested in. And I was like, huh, that was after that wrapped up, I was like, that was kind of interesting. I wonder if I can make this a thing. And then I guess after at the January 2020 was when I branded it, came up with like to the fact that all right, let's try this out for 3 weeks every Thursday, standardize the time so people can reliably, like hopefully remember to come in and start showing up and see what happens and just have an open forum for people to share what they're working on because that's something I'm always intrigued in, especially in the crypto space when there's just so many cool builders and creators and stuff like that. Like you can throw a stone and hit like a million builders. So if you focus on it, hopefully there's some value there. And it started from there, essentially. And I did want to go back though in what you were talking about on the podcast front, and sort of lamenting on the fact that you wish there were like more people that were like open to it and like didn't necessarily think about it as like a main thing or like something to do primarily for money. And it's I think that is one like a really keen insight. A lot of people they initially want to do things for the money, but in what I found to be the case, especially in crypto, which is like almost paradoxical, is that money is like a very weak form of value, especially in crypto when money is like omnipresent and it's all around you. It's not very hard to get. Like it's one of the least interesting forms of value out there. So if it is like your primary reason for doing anything, podcasting, meetups, writing, being in public or whatever, you're going to have a bad time unless you're like one of the 0.01% of like the best people to do that particular thing. You're either not going to make enough to be get excited about or just like you're not going to get listened to or read or whatever it ends up being and it's just, you're going to have a bad time. So then it's really important to find alternative forms of value in those actions or that stem from those actions to keep you around for the longer term. And for the podcast, for the whip in particular, those alternative forms of value are the everything and the entire reason for doing all these things for so many years. And with the whip as a platform to bring bleeding edge builders and creators to share the latest and greatest, like that by itself is such a massive value just intellectually inspiring and stimulating, but also in a very, very real, tangible way that ends up becoming just like very monetarily valuable because bringing people on that are selling something or building something that you can leverage or invest in, like via a token or whatever it ends up being, like all those opportunities are massively valuable. And a real concrete example of that would be 2020 episode of a whip around November. We had Snowfro jump on with Jeff Davis, and they were introducing the early like beta version of Art Blocks, and they had like a beta squiggle mint for folks at the whip at that time before they launched in a few weeks. So a bunch of people were minting beta squiggles. And then anyone who minted there when Art Blocks actually launched and like the real on-chain mainnet version of squiggles launched, people could redeem and get like their on-chain squiggles. And for folks that participated in that particular whip and minted and really kicked the tires and helped add value and like show Eric and Jeff and crew that all right, like what problems were, blah blah blah. Those squiggles ended up being like an immense monetary reward for participants for us like bringing the project on and like having that bird's eye view and being early to it, like that follow on value is just absolutely massive. So focusing on the alternative value of something as opposed to making the monetary aspect primary, I think is the big unlock to try to get more people to open source their thinking, either in the form of these audio conversations or putting their thoughts out there on Twitter or like doing weird and interesting things on the internet.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I didn't know that story about Squiggles. It's great to hear. And yeah, the alpha is in the whip. So for people who haven't been able to check it out, maybe worth knocking on the door. But then again, if you go because you're expecting the alpha for the money, then you probably miss the episodes that actually have it because you're not in it for the right reasons. But it's just interesting to see these, to hear from these early builders, like you said, and just it's just keeps you at the cutting edge, which is great. And so along those lines, I know we're over on time. Do you have like a couple more minutes?
Yeah, I have a hard cut at the half hour mark, so like 9 more
Okay.
minutes.
Perfect. Yeah, I need to figure out what to do with timing of these things because I've just gone over every single time. But and my main podcast, I've always done the opposite of that. I always like I would cut the conversation like on the minute at the hour because I really like want to. My natural tendency is to have like too much respect almost for people's time, and it can almost come off as like rude if I like don't like say stuff after we're done with the recording just because we ended like on the minute. I don't want to like keep them on. So I'm testing the opposite here where I'm just trying to forget about the end time and just have a conversation and naturally that leads me to going over like every time. But the last thing I was going to ask about is you mentioned like what you're up to these days in terms of you'd moved on from Nifty Gateway, and you're doing a lot of advising these days. Obviously, got the podcast like we're talking about. But I'm curious if there's anything, and you mentioned actually, you've been writing pretty prolifically over the years, at least over the long run. And I'm curious if there's other things sort of fundamental to how you spend your time, especially now as you presumably have a bit more of it than when you were like full-time employed. I'm curious if there's just other things that you found or experimented with in doing with your time that, to your previous point, are not doing it necessarily for the money, at least not primarily for the money, but just ways in which you've found enjoying spending your time, even if that's just like working out or whatever. I'm just curious.
Um, yeah, I mean, just doing more collecting, I guess. So, like with the advising and consulting I'm doing, like just very fortunate that it revolves around digital art. So having more free time also means that like I have more free time to continue collecting. So mainly like again, I'll collect anywhere, whatever blockchain doesn't really matter to me, but just have been finding myself continuing to go back again and again and again to object over on Tezos. Just such an amazingly large number of great artists releasing just really good stuff. So I've been
Mm,
just, it really, I've always, it's never not been fun to collect, but now that I have more time in the day to really reflect and like think through what I'm doing, just collecting has become that much more enjoyable. Um, Spending more time with family is probably like the biggest benefit of not being super full time anymore, which is great and will probably continue. I love the kind of speed that life has settled in at this point where I can do a lot of work and be involved in a lot of things, but in like a really time efficient way. And then outside of like spending more time with the family, being able to, especially because this country still has daylight savings time for some stupid reason. So the evenings start earlier. And as someone that loves to trail run, like I currently am over in Portland and we have amazing parks and like we have like some place called Forest Park, which is like a rainforest. And there are hundreds of miles of trails that are just amazing, great views into valleys, like cityscapes and city windows. It's the best place to go to walk or run and to be able to whatever time of day that I have the opportunity to pop on over into the rainforest for a nice trail run to sort of like clear my mind because like when I run, I run naked as I call it. Like I don't have any electronics on me. I don't listen to music. I'm just there running in the moment, clearing my mind or like interrogating whatever thought ends up popping in my mind during that run. So really enjoying the freedom to do that a little bit more. But yeah, outside of that, you know, typing, sharing things in public, putting up blog posts whenever, and yeah, just enjoying all that stuff.
Nice. I respect the naked run as you call it, or I know people are using term raw dogging the flight for a similar concept with not listening to
Yeah.
any audio or anything. You're raw dogging the run. I respect it. It's I've done it, I do it from time to time, but I'm definitely not an every time guy. I like, a podcast. I really don't like listening to music actually when I run. It's too I don't know. The songs that are so short. I feel like it makes the run like I mean it helps you go faster. I think it's like an
Yeah.
adrenaline thing or something, but like I don't need to be like hyped up for my whole run. Like I'd rather just like chill and like one foot after the other and
Hmm.
actually go out of my like just sort of like focus on something, which is, for me it's like a podcast and that's where I do most of my podcast listening. So um mostly I'm listening to podcasts, but on occasion I'll go out and leave the headphones at home. I mean, I love also running with someone, which also is like relatively rare, but having a conversation, running at a conversational pace, that's always great. But yeah, on occasion I will leave the headphones at home, go for a run on my own, and just listen to one foot after the other and be there with whatever's going on around me. And it is highly enjoyable. I just don't have the like I don't have the patience or I don't know what's required to sign up for it every time to like willingly go into it. But every time I do it, I enjoy it. So it's that little like annoying thing, I guess, that's like, well, you could be listening to a podcast during this. That's like that probably makes me not do it more often, but it's a lot of fun. And maybe you sort of inspired me now. I feel like my next run, I'm gonna hit it with I'm gonna raw dog the run and see how that goes. But anyway, I appreciate all the time and you doing this. I know you got to run, but awesome conversation as usual, and looking
Hmm.
forward to sharing it on the Purple app.
Yeah, thanks for bringing me on. Again, like you said, awesome conversation. It's always a great pleasure to chat with you, man. And looking forward to chatting more in the future too.